in Genesis chapter 47. We'll read verses 1 through 12, and then we'll finish up in verse 27 and read through verse 31. Genesis 47, beginning in verse 1. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." They said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." Then Joseph brought in Jacob, his father, and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their dependents. And then in verse 27, "Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, 'If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh, and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place.' He answered, 'I will do as you have said.' And he said, 'Swear to me.' And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed." Amen. About 5 or 6 times in my life, I have had the privilege of being interviewed on television. I remember, I think most of the times were pre-recorded, where they came with a camera, they interviewed you, then they would go back and they'd edit that film, and then they'd play it. It wasn't live, they'd play it recorded in a live program or a live broadcast or something like that. But one time, I had the privilege of being interviewed on live television. And so as I drove into the local TV station, I pulled in, they had a spot with my name on it. It felt like real movie star treatment. It was quite special. Drove in, there's a spot with my name on it. I went into the green room, and there, as soon as I walk in, where they have food and drink to get ready for the live broadcast, there is our sitting U.S. Senator, who was also going to be interviewed on the program before me. And so we had a little small chat, small talk together before going out. But then when they ushered me out to the program during a commercial break, it was absolutely fascinating to see behind the scenes, the cameras and how the cameras work, and the video programming and the picture that they have you looking at on monitor as you're being videoed on live television, and how the commercial breaks are working, and the countdown to live television and all of the rest. It was the first time that I've really had that behind the scenes look at what happens on a TV program. And so I really enjoyed that kind of a behind the scenes look. I got to see what most people don't get to see. I got to see what most people can't. And I think Genesis 47 is doing something very similar to us, or for us. Genesis 47 is taking us behind the scenes, if you will, or at least I want to take you behind the scenes of Genesis 47, because there's something that I want to look at. We might better say someone I want us to look at that is not visible. Most people looking at Genesis 47, most people looking at reading through Genesis 47 do not see God. God's name is never mentioned. God is never alluded to in this passage. There's no reference to him in any way, shape, or form. God is behind the scenes. I want to suggest to you that when we look behind the scenes, we see God. And we see God moving in incredible ways through everything that is happening in Genesis 47. If you look just at the words and just at what Genesis 47 tells us, we will not see God. But if we look behind the scenes, I think we see God, and we see him quite clearly. Genesis 47 is like the book of Esther. The book of Esther doesn't mention the name of God anywhere. But in the book of Esther, God is present everywhere. And that's exactly what I think we see in Genesis 47. God is not mentioned anywhere in this passage, but God is present everywhere, as I hope we will see. So if you've got your outlines, we'll look this morning at what Genesis 47 tells us of God. It gives us this behind-the-scenes look at who God is and what God does. So the first thing I want you to see in this behind-the-scenes look at Genesis 47 is that God strikes straight blows with crooked sticks. God strikes straight blows with crooked sticks. And I think we see that first in the experience of Joseph. Isn't it fascinating to me as the brothers of Joseph and his father, all of his family, come to Egypt? They are, if you will, foreigners. They're sojourners. They've lived in a foreign land. They're coming now to Egypt. And Joseph, having done the same thing, having made the same trip, having been a sojourner, having been a foreigner, coming to Egypt, not by choice, he was sold into Egypt, into slavery, but then promoted to being number 2 in the land of Egypt. And Joseph assimilates into the Egyptian culture. He dresses like an Egyptian. He shaves like an Egyptian. We talked about that already, how he shaved even his head and had a beautiful looking haircut like all of us should have, right? And no beard, none of that. Joseph would have had no facial hair, no hair on his head, very little hair on his body, and that would have been in keeping with Egyptian customs. He was dressing like an Egyptian, he looked like an Egyptian, he was talking like an Egyptian. That's why they used a translator when the brothers came into town to buy grain. Joseph had assimilated into Egyptian culture. He marries an Egyptian woman, and they have Egyptian children who are born there in Egypt. Joseph's whole life was a picture of assimilation. Joseph knew what assimilation was like. Joseph knew what assimilation would do. And no doubt, Joseph. And no doubt Joseph knew God's people, his family, were coming from a foreign land, and they were coming to the land of Egypt because of the famine. And Joseph knew, if he didn't know the promises of God, that God was going to bring his people back to the promised land, he at least knew they were coming during the famine and would therefore be going back after the famine was over. This was not a permanent place for God's people to be. God had made that clear to Jacob when he was on his way to Egypt. And now Joseph, knowing this process of assimilation, puts God's people, his family, in Goshen, about as far removed from the Egyptians as possible. In other words, God seems to be using Joseph's experience of assimilating into Egyptian culture to keep that same thing from happening with his people. And isn't that fascinating? Joseph's whole life was about assimilation. God doesn't want his people assimilating, because what happens if God's people intermarry? What happens if God's people begin to plug into the cities of Egypt and to live in the cities of Egypt and raise children there and grandchildren there? Their roots are going to be there, and they're not going to want to or be as easily able to leave when the time comes. And so God, in his wisdom, wants them to be in Goshen, a land kept separate. It's a land that's actually on the way to the promised land. It's as close as you possibly can get to the land of Canaan. And yet, Joseph makes that decision to put God's people there. Joseph's experience, no doubt, of assimilation would have led to him making that decision. And so I think part of what we're seeing in what God is doing behind the scenes in Genesis chapter 47 is that he's using Joseph's experience of assimilation and his familiarity with assimilation to keep the same things from happening to his own people and to keep them separate in the land of Goshen. But he's not only using Joseph's experience, he's also using Joseph's planning. Because it's Joseph, you remember, who designs and intends God's people to be in Goshen. If you look back to chapter 46, he tells the brothers, in verse 33, when Pharaoh calls you and says, "What is your occupation?" Verse 34, "You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers." Why? In order that, verse 34, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So Joseph is planning to put his family in Goshen. And he's planning to put them in Goshen, but now he's got to convince Pharaoh that they need to be in Goshen, because Pharaoh's the number one. Joseph's number two. He doesn't have the right to make all of these decisions unless Pharaoh says that it's so. So he has to get Pharaoh's permission. He has to get Pharaoh's approval. And that's what happens in chapter 47. But part of that plan is to arrange the way they are presenting themselves to Pharaoh so that Pharaoh will be persuaded to put them in the land of Goshen. And so the first thing Joseph does is he says, "Okay, brothers, when Pharaoh asks you what your occupation is, you say, we're shepherds, because shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. They won't want you to be around. Shepherds are an abomination. They'll want you to be in the land of Goshen. Pharaoh will want you in the land of Goshen. Therefore, we'll get what we want. We'll get you separate in the land of Goshen." But it's not only that. He also tells them, he doesn't just tell Pharaoh that your occupation is shepherds. But he says, tell Pharaoh you've always been shepherds. Your forefathers were shepherds. For generations you've been shepherds. And the idea is, if Pharaoh catches wind that you guys are good at something besides shepherding, he's not going to want you in Goshen. He's going to want you closer in so he can take advantage of your skills and your talents in other areas for his benefit. So what does he tell them? He says, tell them that from our youth even to now, both we and our fathers have only been shepherds. And then when they appear before Pharaoh in chapter 47, and he says in verse 3, "What is your occupation?" the brothers follow what Joseph tells them to do. And they say, "We are shepherds, as our fathers were." In other words, we can't do anything else. We don't know anything else. All we know is shepherding. That's why we should be in Goshen, you see? And that's exactly the whole point. Joseph has decided to put them in Goshen, and now he's got to persuade Pharaoh that they should be in Goshen. So Joseph is scheming and planning, if you will, on how best to present this argument to Pharaoh. Tell them you're shepherds, because shepherds are an abomination. And tell them you've only been shepherds. Because if you just say you're shepherds, he may keep you a little closer by so that you can do some other things. We're shepherds, but we've also done some steel working, some metal working or whatever. Oh, okay. Well, then we'll keep you close by and you can use those things for the good and the glory of Egypt. No, we've only and always been shepherds. So Joseph is scheming and planning to convince Pharaoh that this is what Pharaoh wants to do. But he's not only scheming and planning in terms of telling the brothers what to say, but notice down in verse 2. He doesn't send all the brothers to appear before Pharaoh. He only sends 5. And notice what the text says. So the ESV is a little bit hidden. And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Quite literally in the Hebrew it says, from the extremity he took 5. From the extremity. The idea seems to be he didn't just choose any old 5. He chose those that were on the extreme. In other words, these were probably the most gifted, the most suitable to impress Pharaoh. He didn't parade everybody by him. He was making sure they put their best foot forward. He wanted to persuade Pharaoh they should be in Goshen and not closer by. So maybe it wasn't the best among them. It was just those that would most impress or persuade Pharaoh. Maybe it was the worst among them, right? But it was from the extreme. The point is, it wasn't just all of the brothers. He was particular, selective in who he chose to come before Pharaoh so as best to give his argument weight. He wanted Pharaoh to see they needed to be in Goshen. They needed to be separate. So Joseph's experience of assimilation is used by God to put the people in Goshen and to keep them separate. But Joseph's planning and Joseph's scheming is used by God to put the people in Goshen. But then third, Joseph's platform is used by God to put the people in Goshen. Look at how Pharaoh responds to Joseph's argument. Verse 5. Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Pharaoh says, yeah, give them whatever you want. Put them wherever you want them to be. You see, the idea seems to be Pharaoh so loves Joseph. Pharaoh so highly regards Joseph. Joseph's reputation in the eyes of Pharaoh is such that Pharaoh says, you put them wherever you want to. You give them the best of the land. You do as your heart desires. I trust you, Joseph. I love you, Joseph. You're like a son to me, Joseph. You put them where you... It's Joseph's reputation. It's his platform with Pharaoh that gets the brothers and his father, Jacob, favoritism, what they want, the land of Goshen. But more than that, look at verse 6. He doesn't just say, settle them in the best of the land. He says, if you want them in Goshen, basically, right, let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Now we know Pharaoh had considerable livestock. One record, one history book says that just in terms of head of cattle, Pharaoh owned well over 100,000 head of cattle. So the overseer for the livestock of Pharaoh would not have been a small, looked down upon role. This was a significant role governing and watching over the food supply for the house of Pharaoh especially, but for the people of Egypt as well, for all of the family of Pharaoh. And here Pharaoh, such is the regard that Pharaoh has for Joseph, and for his reputation, and such is the trust that he has in Joseph, that he's willing to take all of his livestock, not only give them the land of Goshen, what they want, but he's also willing to take sight unseen, without knowing or interviewing any of the brothers. This is the first time some of the brothers appear to Pharaoh. He doesn't take them aside, interview them. Let's see if they're trustworthy before I put my flock, my livestock, in their hands. No, based on the reputation of Joseph, Pharaoh says, what is astounding? If you say so, I'll put all my livestock in their care. It's an absolutely astounding thing. God is using sinful, finite, if you will, temporal desires, plans, experiences to accomplish His perfect purposes. God regularly does that. He strikes a straight blow with a crooked stick. God uses sinners like you and me, like Joseph, like the brothers, like Jacob, to accomplish His perfect purposes. God is in the business of striking straight blows with crooked sticks. And that ought to be incredibly encouraging for you and me. You see, you and I don't have to clean ourselves up to be used by God. We don't have to be super holy. You know, one of the byproducts of being a pastor is you never know how people are going to respond to that. I've sat next to people on planes, and now that I'm not a pastor, technically pastoring a church, I'm running the seminary and teaching. I can have a different thing I can tell people when I sit next to them on a plane. What do you do? I can tell them. But before, I would say I'm a pastor, and there was usually one of two responses. It usually ended the conversation right there, and they wanted nothing to do with it, or they were intrigued. Oh, pastor? Oh, tell me about that, whatever. And in the course of the flight, routinely, somehow they would swear. So there was something come up and they'd use some bad language and look, oh, I am so sorry. As if, what is that? And I would usually tell them, I was like, look, you don't have to apologize to me. I'm a man like you are, right? Your problem was with the Lord, not with me, I'm just a man. And I've been known to use some language from time to time too. As I've said to some of you guys, this may be a little bit inappropriate, but it's true. There are some times a four-letter word is just the right word, right? It's just the right word. And even though I certainly advocate a bigger vocabulary than that, if that's all we're saying, we need to expand our vocabulary. But there are some times when it's just the right word for that context. And anyway, but there's that idea where they're treating me different just because I'm a pastor. And I think we sometimes think that. Well, pastors, they're used by God. Or, certain people in the church that we put up on a pedestal, they're used by God. But one of the things we learn from this passage is that God routinely, regularly strikes straight blows with crooked sticks. God uses sinners. Pastors are sinners. Those we put on pedestals within the church are sinners with feet of clay, just as we are and have. God uses sinners to accomplish His perfect purposes. And that's what we see here in Genesis 47. And that ought to be encouraging to every one of us. No matter who you are or what you've done is no barrier to God using you, because He regularly strikes straight blows with crooked sticks. So that's the first thing I want you to see in Genesis chapter 47. The second is that God is bigger and better than anyone or anything. God is bigger and better than anyone or anything. I love this whole passage. It's absolutely fantastic. When Joseph brings Jacob in before Pharaoh, their whole interaction is marvelous. The first thing Jacob does, Joseph presents Jacob to Pharaoh, and the very first thing is he blesses Pharaoh. Isn't that fascinating? He blesses him. And then again in verse 10, when he leaves, the very last thing he does when he leaves Pharaoh's presence is to bless Pharaoh again. Twice this word, same word, to bless, is used. The word occurs 70 other times in the book of Genesis. 36 of those 70 other occurrences are used of God blessing, providing for, showering goodness upon His people. 25 of those 70 are used of God's people blessing other people by way of praying for them, praying God's blessing upon them. And so I think there's more here than just a farewell, a greeting. Some scholars look at this and say, since it happens before, at the beginning, and at the end, that all Jacob is doing is just saying, hey, how are you? And then goodbye. It's a greeting. He's blessing him as in greeting him. I don't think that's the way the word is being used here. Because of the predominance of the occurrence of the word, almost all of the occurrences in Genesis are of God blessing or of people beseeching God to bless on behalf of someone else. So I think what is happening here is that Jacob is praying over Pharaoh. He's praying God's blessing to be upon Pharaoh. So he comes into the throne room of the most powerful man in the most powerful nation at the time. And the first thing he does is he prays. And he prays Yahweh's blessing upon the king, who, by the way, if you remember, in Egyptian culture was a god. He was the manifestation of the god Amun-Ra. And so here's Jacob coming into his presence and praying that Yahweh, the one true God, would bless this small g God, the one who's looked upon by his people as being God, who's not God, because there's only one God. And so Jacob prays that the one true God would bless this perceived God. It's absolutely astounding. That's not what we would expect. You walk into the White House for a weekend, for an audience with the president. You're the guest. You're not the host. The president is the host. The Pharaoh, in this case, is the host. Jacob is the guest. And yet Jacob plays the host, not the guest. He takes the initiative. He prays over Pharaoh. You can almost visualize the context. It's like Jacob lays his hands on Pharaoh and prays over Pharaoh, God's blessings to be on Pharaoh. We don't know if that actually happened, but that wouldn't be far off what seems to be going on here. And twice, Jacob plays the host, not the guest. Doesn't that tell us something about Jacob's God? You see, our God owns everything. There's not one square inch in all of the universe over which God has not said, mine. He owns all of Egypt. He owns every hostile territory. He owns every dangerous piece of ground. No matter how outnumbered we are, no matter how hostile the enemy may be, that territory is God's. It's His kingdom. Jacob seems to know that. And so he's in Egypt on someone else's turf, but he knows this isn't Pharaoh's turf. This is God's turf. This is God's territory. My God is sovereign. This is His land. He's king, not Pharaoh. He's God, not Pharaoh. And so Jacob plays the host, and he blesses Pharaoh. It's absolutely astounding. He takes the initiative. You read that whole section. Jacob's the one in charge. He leaves. I love verse 10. He goes out from the presence of Pharaoh. Never are we told that he's dismissed. He just leaves. He's the one in charge. He's the host because he knows our God is bigger and He's better than anyone or anything. And there's something tremendously encouraging there. No matter where you are, no matter where you go, you are home. You are not guest, you are host, because your God owns it all. Your God is king, and He reigns and rules over every square inch. If there's life on Mars or on some distant planet, which I don't think there is, but if there is, when you and I get there, we're not guests, we're hosts. Because that planet is owned by our God too. And it's in the bounds of his kingdom too. And Jacob seems to realize that, and so plays the host rather than playing the guest. But more than that, look at how Pharaoh, this supposed God, responds, how Pharaoh interacts. He acquiesces. He gives to them the best of the land, verses 5 and 6, right? The land of Egypt is before you. Have what you want. Settle where you want. In the best of the land, the best that we have to offer is yours. If you want Goshen, you take Goshen. And isn't it fascinating? This one that the people look to as being God, the manifestation of Amun-Ra, this one does the bidding of Yahweh, the one true God. This God, perceived to be God, does what the one true God, Yahweh, wants him to do, to put his people in the land of Goshen, to keep them separate. So all the way through, don't we see this idea behind the scenes that it's not just that God is using sinful people to accomplish his perfect purposes, but it's also true that God is bigger and he's better than Pharaoh. He's bigger and he's better than anything Egypt has to offer. He's bigger and he's better because he's God. But the third thing I want us to see today in this behind-the-scenes view of Genesis chapter 47 is that God blesses and is the blessing himself. God blesses, but he is the real blessing. I love Pharaoh's question to Jacob. I said this whole interaction is just priceless. Jacob stands before Pharaoh and says, and blesses him, right? Prays over him that he might be blessed by God. And what does Pharaoh say? How old are you? Now, we don't know what the average life expectancy was in Egypt. The Bible doesn't tell us what the life expectancy was in Egypt. But archaeology does give us some kind of guidance. Archaeologists, by going back and looking at the mummies that they've discovered in ancient Egypt, even at this time, of the time when God's people were there in Egypt, using mummies and the mummy remains and all of that, they've been able to determine the lifespan in ancient Egypt was probably 40 to 50 years old. Okay? So here's Pharaoh in the prime of his life. Let's say he's 30. We don't know, but he's probably somewhere in that vicinity. And here's Jacob, who's 130. And he blesses, he prays over, and it's in all of that, no doubt his voice quivering because he's so old, right? Pharaoh says, how old are you? Isn't that a sign of God's blessing? Pharaoh sees Jacob, and the first thing he marvels at is that this man has lived a long life. If the average lifespan in Egypt was 40 to 50 years, and Jacob stands before him at 130, and then notice what Jacob says. Few have been the years of my life. Few have been the years of my life, right? In other words, Abraham, my grandfather, lived far longer than I. You think I'm old, right? You got another thing coming. You think I'm old? Abraham lived to 175. Isaac, my father, lived to 180. I'm only 130, right? Isn't that a picture of God's blessing upon his people? This would have been a visual reminder, a visual testimony to Pharaoh and to the people of Egypt. Joseph wouldn't have been the same visual testimony because Joseph was relatively young. He would have been about the same age probably as Pharaoh. He's in his 30s as he's there ruling and reigning and doing all that he is. But Jacob is 130. And so that would have been a visual testimony of God's favor upon Jacob, giving him long life and extending the days of his life. So that God blesses Jacob. And that would have been a visual testimony. So that Pharaoh potentially would have asked for the reason, for the hope, that is in him, because he would have seen it just in his old age. A tangible, visible sign of God's blessing in his life. But isn't there more here? Because I think when Jacob blesses Pharaoh twice, he's doing something that is absolutely astounding. Because remember, Egypt is the richest country on the face of the earth at this time. It's the most powerful country on the face of the earth at this time. He's standing in Pharaoh's palace. He's standing before the throne room, in the throne room of the most powerful person in the most powerful nation at the time. Pharaoh would have been dressed in his best, no doubt ornamented with gold and other jewels. Opulence would have been on display in the surroundings and in Pharaoh's person. He was the picture of youth, the picture of strength and vitality and power. And here's Jacob, 130 years old, who comes in, and what does he say? I'm a sojourner, and I come from sojourners. We're nomads. We've never had a place of our own. Pharaoh was born in Egypt. His father was born in Egypt because his father would have been Pharaoh before him. And before him, for generations, Pharaoh had the permanence of being in Egypt, in opulence and luxury and riches and power. And here's Jacob, 130 years old, dressed in probably his only garment, standing in that place. And the first thing he does is bless Pharaoh. It's absolutely astounding. There's no fear of man here in Jacob. He doesn't fear the power. He's not overwhelmed by the opulence. He's not won over by all of those things. He is able to point to the Lord. In the process of, he doesn't care what Pharaoh thinks. And doesn't that tell us something about where Jacob was coming from? Jacob was blessed by God. 130 years was the testimony to that blessing. But Jacob must have seen that God was his chief blessing. He didn't care what Pharaoh thought. He could come into Pharaoh's presence and bless him as a nomad, as a nobody who was old, well beyond his prime. No power, nothing to commend him to Pharaoh, no riches. You remember, Jacob and God's people were not poor, but their wealth was in livestock. It wasn't in gold. It wasn't in silver like it was in Egypt. There was gold everywhere in Egypt. You can see the tombs today and see it. There's gold everywhere in Egypt. That wasn't what Jacob would have. He wouldn't have come dressed with the jewels and the gold that Pharaoh would have been. And yet he still blesses Pharaoh. And I think that tells us that Jacob's treasure wasn't in gold. It wasn't in silver. It wasn't in the opinions of Pharaoh or the opinions of any person. Jacob's treasure was the God who had blessed him and made him a blessing to all that he came in contact with. So Jacob is blessed by God, but God is Jacob's chief blessing, I think we see as well. And then fourthly and finally, I want you to see here behind the scenes in Genesis 47 that God is more committed to us than we are to him. This is something we've seen over and over again, although I think we'll see it in a little bit different way here in Genesis 47. But we've seen over and over again in our study of Genesis that God is more committed to his people than his people are to him. And we see it here as well. In verse 9, Jacob responds to Pharaoh and doesn't simply say that his years have been few, but he says something quite interesting. My years have been evil. Evil have been the days of the years of my life. Isn't that fascinating? What is it that Jacob is putting his finger on? We don't really know. Jacob doesn't tell us, but we know the story of Jacob. We know his whole life story. Jacob, which means what? Deceiver, liar, cheater, stealer, thief, the one who has been self-reliant and has tried to control all of his circumstances to get what he wants. That's been Jacob's life story. He's the one who's been, if you will, been afraid to take what God wants for him to have. He's gone out there and taken it for himself. He's the one who's been in control. He's the one who's lied, cheated, and stolen to get what he wants for his whole life. Could it be that now at the end of his life, Jacob is realizing that his life has been filled with sin? It's been filled with selfishness. It's been filled with self-reliance and independence. He has not been dependent upon the Lord. He's not been reliant upon God and God's provision. He has been rebellious, and he's been selfish, and he sought to control rather than to depend upon the Lord. That could be what Jacob's saying here. Or it could be that Jacob is saying, all of my sins have made my life hard. Jacob's whole life has not only been filled with sinfulness, as ours is too, but Jacob's life has been filled with trouble because of his sin. Jacob has brought troubles on his own head, right? From the very beginning when he stole the birthright and then stole the blessing, Esau wanted to kill him. And so he had to leave. He had to flee to go find a wife to get away from Esau because Esau wanted to take his life. His own brother was trying to kill him. He goes away, and what happens when he's with Laban? Laban cheats him. Laban cheats him, tricks him, gives him Leah instead of Rachel. And he works 14 years for 2 wives. And then when he's working for the livestock, he swaps out his wages and changes the way he's being paid. Laban tricks him and deceives him. And then when they finally leave and escape, Laban hunts them down and chases them down. And then you know as well as you remember Jacob faces Esau again. And he doesn't know Esau's a changed man, but he doesn't know it. And so he's fearful that everything he's done is going to come back on his head. Rachel dies in childbirth. He loses his beloved wife. He buries her. Joseph, he thinks is dead, is sold into slavery, right? And is gone from him forever. The famine comes, and they have no choice but to beg and borrow and steal, if you will, for food in Egypt. And he thinks he's lost Benjamin for a time too, because of sending him down into Egypt, not knowing whether he would come back. So all of these things, Jacob could be looking back over his life and seeing all of the hardship that he brought on himself because of his selfishness, because of his hard-headedness and hard-heartedness. We don't really know, but whatever Jacob's got in mind, he's thinking about his failures. And he's thinking about what those failures have caused in his own life. And yet, despite all of that, how does God treat Jacob? Verse 28. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. He's so old that Pharaoh says, "How old are you?" And yet he lives for 17 more years. Isn't that fascinating? Don't you remember how long Jacob lived with Joseph before he was sold into slavery? 17 years. He was 17, Joseph was, when he was sold into slavery. God gives him as much time as he had with Joseph before the slavery. He gives it to him before he dies. Isn't that God's goodness to Jacob? Despite the evil of his days, despite his sinfulness and his rebellion and his selfishness, God is exceedingly good to Jacob. But there's more. Look at the end of Jacob's life. Jacob brings Joseph into his presence, makes him put his hand under his thigh and swear this promise, no doubt that's meant to show the solemn nature of this and to get him. It's kind of like putting your hand on a Bible, right? And saying, I swear to God to tell the truth and nothing but the truth kind of a thing. That seems to be something similar here. And he says to him, if I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Jacob knew that God was going to bring his people back to Canaan. And Jacob didn't want to stay in Egypt. So he made Joseph swear that he would carry him back to back to Canaan, and would bury him with his fathers in the cave at Machpelah. There's faith in the end that's on display. At the very end of Joseph's life, Joseph, if you will, has come 180 degrees from Jacob, the deceiver, to now we see in Jacob's life the truster, the surrenderer. He's given over to God, and he's believing in God, and he's walking with God. But more, look at verse 31. He says to Joseph, swear to me. And Joseph swore to him. Then he bowed himself on the head of his bed. Now, we don't know exactly how that word is to be translated, although I would argue it should not be translated bed. I don't know why the ESV translates it as bed. If you know, just to give you a little bit on Hebrew, the Hebrew that we have, the original Hebrew, is only consonants. Vowels are not there in the Hebrew. The Masoretes, a group called the Masoretes between the 6th and 9th centuries AD, went back and added in pointers, literally dots and lines and things around the Hebrew consonants to tell us what the vowels should be so that we know how to pronounce the different words. But in the Hebrew text, there's only consonants. The vowel pointers that occur on this word that's translated bed tell us to translate the word bed. But the consonants for the word that could be translated bed and the consonants for the word that could be translated staff are exactly the same consonants. The vowels are different, but the consonants are the same. So the Masoretes between the 6th and 9th centuries put in the vowels that tell us to translate the word as bed. However, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, written before Christ, the translation was done about probably the 2nd to 3rd century BC, before Christ. Okay, the Masoretes made this change in the 6th to 9th century AD, after Christ. So this is long before Christ. The Septuagint translates this word that we've translated here as bed as staff. Okay? And more definitively, in Hebrews 11, verse 21, the text that we read there is staff. It says in Hebrews 11:21 that Jacob blessed his sons as he worshiped on his staff. Okay? As he worshiped on his staff. My point is, more than likely, this is not meant to be bed. And I think Hebrews 11, verse 21, being in the New Testament, is definitive proof of that. But we know the point here is not that he's bowing upon his bed, as in he's dying. That's not the point, because he doesn't die until the end of chapter 49. He goes on and blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, and then blesses all of the other sons as well in chapter 49, and we'll look at those over the next couple of weeks. So the point doesn't seem that he's dying, doesn't seem to be that he's dying, and the point doesn't seem that he's somehow slumping over his bed, but rather, I think, as Hebrews tells us, he's worshiping. He's worshiping on the head of his staff. Here at the end of Jacob's life, he responds, Jacob, the deceiver, Jacob, the liar, the cheater, the swindler, at the end of his life, submits to God and bows in submission and humble reverence and worship before the God of the universe. And I find that fascinating, especially in light of Jacob's own appraisal of his own life. My days have been few and evil, riddled with sin, riddled with hardship. My days have been evil, riddled with sin and hardship, and yet he bows in worship on the head of his staff. Edward Payson was a 19th century minister in New England, the New England area, who went through amazing hardship in his life. He lost 2 children in infancy. They died while they were still infants. And worse than all of that, if you can imagine that, he was in an accident when he was 24 years old, a horse riding accident. When he was 24 years old, he was thrown from his horse. And his arm, as a result of that accident, was permanently paralyzed. And that paralysis, over the next 20 years of his life, spread to his entire body. And he eventually became fully incapacitated and died at the age of 44. And right before he died, this is what Payson said. Christians might avoid much trouble and inconvenience if they would only believe what they profess, that God is able to make them happy without anything else. To mention my own case, God has been depriving me of one blessing after another. But as every one was removed, He has come in and filled up the place. And now, when I am crippled and not able to move, I am happier than I was in all my life before or ever expect to be. Isn't that something of what we see in the life of Jacob? Evil are his days, filled with sin, filled with hardship, most of it at his own doing. He brought it all back upon himself. And yet at the end of his days, he bows in worship. God, through all of the evil, through all of the hardship, has made him happier at the end of his life than he ever has been or ever will be. And isn't that what God offers us in Christ? It's not happiness here so much as it's happiness forevermore. Because God has taken all of our guilt and laid it upon Christ. God has given to us eternal bliss and eternal blessing, so that God doesn't treat Jacob the way the evil of his days deserves. And God doesn't treat us the way the evil of our days deserve. Because he's already treated Christ as the evil of our days deserve. So that we might get an eternity of happiness with the Lord forevermore. That's the glory of the gospel message, isn't it? And that seems to be what's on display in this behind-the-scenes look at Genesis chapter 47. God is accomplishing His perfect purposes in and through imperfect people. God is, He's bigger and He's better than anyone or anything. And God blesses His people. But He Himself is the real blessing. But more than that, God is far more committed to Jacob, and He's far more committed to you and me in Christ than we are to Him. And He's so committed to making us happy here, but forevermore, mostly, that He's willing to use the evil of our days to accomplish that very purpose. Amen?